It was long ago on the borders of Scotland that there was a young farmer. He lived alone. His parents were long gone and he had no siblings, but he did have a fine, fine farm. It was a large piece of land, farmland and pasture land and woodlands as well. And one day he observed that there was someone, a traveler, that had set up a camp on the edge of his property. And in looking, he realized that the traveler was a woman and young and quite pretty. The next morning, that young woman came to the door of his farmhouse, knocked at the door, and asked him for permission to stay on his land for a time. This he was glad to grant, for he had plenty of room, and she was, as I said, pretty, and he was taken by not only her beauty, but her kind and gentle manner. He told her to stay as long as she wanted. And after that, every few days or so, he found a reason to visit her where she was camping, to take her something that he thought that she might need. And after a few days and maybe a few weeks, there are a few things that became clear to him. First of all, is she was alone. There was nobody with her and she'd had no visitors. And second, it was clear that she was expecting a child. But again, as the weeks went along, he began to realize something else, and that was that he was falling in love with her. One day, he got up his courage and he told her that he had fallen in love with her and wished to marry her. And he added that he knew that she was expecting a baby and that would not be a problem. He would be pleased to welcome and raise that child as if it were his own. Well, she admitted that she had fallen in love with him as well. And so the two were married. After a few months, the baby was born. It was a little girl and a beautiful, beautiful baby. Fair skin, rosy cheeks, and hair. Oh my goodness. The hair was what everybody noticed right off. It was thick and black, but it did have a sort of a white streak up the middle, zigzag, like a lightning bolt. And they named her Aspen. That was her mother's favorite tree. Well, not even 2 years after Aspen was born, there was another baby born. This was a boy that they named Robert. Robert and Aspen grew up together and got along exceptionally well for siblings. Of course, they teased each other, but they did work together at the farmhouse and in the farm. They supported each other and were glad for the companionship. Aspen, as I said, was a beautiful baby. And as the years went on, she grew to be a beautiful, beautiful young woman. All the people in the town recognized that, but they liked her not just for her beauty, but for her intelligent mind and her quick wit. She did have one unusual practice, however. Every night when she took her hair down, she would brush it. And as she did, she would sway back and forth and sing a song. It was always the same song, though no one had ever taught her the words or the music. Well, one day, Aspen was 15 years old, and one day there came a man riding up to the farmhouse. He was obviously rich. He was dressed in the finest fashion. He was very handsome in an exotic sort of way. He was on a wonderful horse. The horse had a saddle of fine tooled Spanish leather, and hanging from the saddle, a leather bag that jingled, clearly full of quite a bit of money. He came up to the door, and when Aspen's father and mother answered, he said, "I have heard that you have a beautiful daughter, and I have come to make her my wife." Aspen's mother said, "Well, we cannot answer for Aspen. You'll have to talk to her yourself." And so Aspen was sent for, and when she heard the proposal, she blushed and she said, "Oh, but good sir, I am only 15, too young to marry. But if you come back in a year's time, I will give you my answer then." And the man went away disappointed, but vowing to come back in a year. Now, there was something about that stranger that made Robert uneasy. and he decided to follow the man to see if there was anything he could learn about him. He followed him for a couple of hours, and finally the stranger stopped by a lock, and he bent down to drink from the water of the lock. And as he drank from the water in his hand, oh, there was a transformation. Fur and fangs and claws. He was a werewolf, and large and menacing. Well, Robert, still hidden, shuddered and returned home, quite relieved that Aspen had not agreed to marry him. And life went on as usual for a year. But a year to the very day that stranger appeared again with the same proposal that Aspen come with him and be his wife. And this time, Aspen said yes. With a broad grin on his face, the stranger led her to his horse and pulled her up behind him on the horse. And even though Aspen's mother protested, he said, "Oh, do not be worried. I am very rich, and your daughter will be having a life of luxury and delight." And then before anyone could say anything else, they were off. Well, Robert had been working in the field at the time, and when he came back to the house and learned that Aspen had agreed to go with a stranger that he knew to be a werewolf, he was horrified. He immediately mounted his own horse and headed off in the direction that they'd gone, hoping to catch up to them and to persuade Aspen to come home. But he traveled for 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, and finally, at dusk on the third day, he came to a large and beautiful mansion. He approached the door and he was greeted by a servant who asked him what his purpose was in being there. And he said that he'd brought wedding gifts for his sister and he wished to see her. Well, the servant replied that his master had said that he and his intended bride were upstairs planning for the wedding and they wished not to be disturbed. But at that very moment, there was the most horrifying, loud, blood-curdling shriek that came from a room at the top of the stairs. Robert took the stairs 2 at a time and burst into the room and then froze. For what he saw was in the middle of the room, a snake, an adder, huge snake, as long as the room was tall, and black, except for along the length of the snake, a white streak, zigzag, like a lightning bolt. And in the corner of the room, he saw a pile of bloody fur that was surely all that was left of the werewolf. As he stood there, wondering, a thick mist grew around the snake, and when it cleared, there was Aspen in her usual form. She saw the look of extreme surprise on his face and began to explain. She had come to know that her natural father was, in fact, a snake, the king of the adders. But when her mother had learned that she was to have a child, she said that she wanted to live with that child in the world of humans rather than adders. And Aspen said that her natural father, the king of the adders, had noticed that the farmer was kind and considerate to her mother, and so he did not object to their marriage. But she also said that as the years had gone by, that she had realized that she had inherited some of the special gifts of her father, including a kind of a second sight, and that the very first time she had seen that stranger, she had recognized that he was indeed a werewolf. And when he came back, she agreed to go with him, thinking that if she refused, he might harm her family, and feeling confident that she would be able to protect herself. And so Robert and Aspen went back to the farmhouse, where they were greeted by their parents, who were happy and much, much, much relieved that they were safe. And they listened with horror and amazement at the story that they told. Well, a few years passed, and Aspen married a young farmer that she'd met in the village. And Robert, for his part, he married a young woman that he'd had his eye on. And so all six of them lived happily ever after, which is the very way that I like stories to end. But I must add that they always knew that if they were ever in danger again, well, it was pretty sure that Aspen would be able to protect them. And that is the story from Scotland that apparently was a favorite of the Scottish storyteller Stanley Robertson. And I am happy for the opportunity to pass it along to you.